So thanks for joining us for a conversation on the politics and implications of Brexit. In this age of pandemic, the Brexit deal itself, just under 2 months old, and the furious negotiations and speculation leading up to it may seem like a distant memory. But today we pause to examine the consequences of the final Brexit deal for the UK, for the European Union, and for the greater global community. My name is Doug Kreiner, and I am a professor of government at Cornell and the faculty director of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs. Before properly introducing our outstanding panel this afternoon, I'd like to alert all of you to an upcoming Institute event at which we can promise, hopefully, no technical difficulties. This event on March 18th at 5 p.m. we'll be hosting a conversation with President Bill Clinton on the future of American democracy. Not exactly a timely topic with everything that's been going on in American politics lately. More details coming shortly, and for the latest updates, please check our website at iopga.cornell.edu. It's now my pleasure to introduce, albeit too quickly, our panelists for this afternoon, reserving as much time as possible for Q&A and discussion. Many thanks to each of you in advance for making the time to be with us today. Our first guest is the British Consul General in New York and Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for North America, Antony Phillipson. Mr. Phillipson joined the civil service in 1993 and has held a number of posts in Her Majesty's government, including serving as the Prime Minister's Private Secretary for Foreign Affairs, British High Commissioner to Singapore, and Director for International Agreements and Trade. Thank you so much for joining us. Our second guest is Ginny Doellgast, Associate Professor of Comparative Employment Relations in the ILR School at Cornell University. Professor Doellgast's research examines how employment relations institutions at national, industry, and organizational levels affect organizational restructuring and human resource management policies, as well as the impact of these policies on pay and job quality for different employee groups. Prior to joining us at Cornell, Professor Doellgast taught at both the London School of Economics and King's College London. Her book, Disintegrating Democracy at Work, Labor Unions and the Future of Good Jobs in the Service Economy, was published by Cornell University Press in 2012. Our third panelist is Graham Wilson, Professor of Political Science and Director of the Initiative on Cities at Boston University. Professor Wilson's research is focused primarily on interest groups and their relationships with government and the policymaking process. He's authored or edited 10 books, including the Oxford Handbook on Business and Government. He has served as the editor of both the British Journal of Political Science and Governance, and is former chair of the British Politics Group of the American Political Science Association. And our final panelist this evening is Thomas Wright, the director of the Center on the United States and Europe, and a senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy at the Brookings Institution. An expert on US foreign policy, great power competition, the European Union, Brexit, and economic interdependence, Dr. Wright is also a contributing writer for The Atlantic and a non-resident fellow at the Lowy Institute for International Policy. Dr. Wright is the author of All Measures Short of War, The Contest for the 21st Century and the Future of American Power, which was published by Yale University Press in May of 2017, and his second book, Aftershocks, Pandemic Politics and the End of the Old International Order, will be published by St. Martin's Press in 2021. Finally, I'm also incredibly grateful to our moderator for this evening, Ali Cirone, Assistant Professor and Himan Brown Faculty Fellow in the Department of Government at Cornell. Ali is an expert on European politics and historical political economy, and her work has been published in the American Political Science Review, the Journal of Politics, and World Politics, among other outlets. Thanks again to all of our guests, and Ali, the floor is yours to get us started.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone, both to our esteemed panelists and our audience members for joining us, joining the IOPGA this afternoon. So today we are here to talk about Brexit. Some of you may recall a narrow referendum in 2016 on leaving the European Union led to years of negotiation, a very long transition period, which recently culminated in a deal that meant the UK left the trading bloc very recently in December. Since then, Brexit has been overseen by 3 separate prime ministers, various governments, coalition and majority, and arguably has had some significant impacts on the domestic political landscape as well as international relations. So today we've assembled a great panel of experts to speak today. We've also taken note of questions. So those of you attendees who submitted questions beforehand, we've taken your questions into consideration, and we'll ask them a bit later. Also, for those in the audience, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and submit these as we go along, and we'll try to get as many answers and questions in as the time permits. So to get started, I'm going to ask each panelist for opening statements. So each guest will spend 2 or 3 minutes giving their perspective on Brexit before we go on to questions and more back and forth dialogue. Actually, if we could go ahead and start with Antony Phillipson.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be with you. As ever, I just wish it could be in person, but I hope everyone is staying safe. So the risk of, I'm not sure how we do Brexit in 2 to 3 minutes. So let me just say 3 very quick things about what I think it means for the UK and the EU, the UK with the EU, and indeed the UK in the world. Because Brexit is a process. Brexit is simply the UK moving into the next phase of its relationship with the EU member states. And of course, that has an impact on our relationship with others. I don't want to underplay the significance of the UK leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, leaving the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, a state that we had existed and thrived in over the previous sort of 4 decades. But as you say, in the referendum in 2016, the British people were asked a question, they gave an answer, and British governments and civil service have spent the time since then delivering on that answer. And as Douglas mentioned before I came out here in November 2017, I was in the Department for Equity in the EU. I had been in the European Secretariat at the time of the referendum, so I've seen it from the inside as well as now from the outside. And as I say, I don't underestimate the significance, but it is a process that affects the context in which the UK is pursuing its strategic priorities. And those include continuing to pursue them with in a dialogue and an agreement and a negotiation with the EU. Although we left the transition period at the end of December last year, we are still talking to our European colleagues through the Commission about financial services arrangements with a view to signing an MOU by March. We're talking about important issues around adequacy on the data front. And indeed, there are now 19, I think it is, subcommittees set up to govern this relationship, now with Lord Frost in the Cabinet Office sitting at the top of those structures. And crucially, of course, there's also the ongoing work through the Joint Committee on the Northern Ireland Protocol. So, Brexit is not done in that sense, but Brexit, in the sense of the UK leaving the EU, was actually done at the end of January last year. We are just now moving into the new phases of this relationship. It also does not mean that we are not working intensely closely with the EU on some of the big issues of the day. So we are working with them in the G7. The Prime Minister chaired a meeting of the virtual meeting of the leaders on Friday last week, before some of them also then moved into a virtual session with the Munich Security Conference. The Italian Prime Minister, the French President, the German Chancellor, the Commission President, the Council President, all there. So we are working with the EU and its member states intensely, closely on the prosperity priorities, the security priorities that we all face. And then there's the UK in the world. The 2 big topics I think that the UK will be leading discussion on through the G7 and also through preparation for the COP summit in November: climate, COVID recovery, making sure that we can provide vaccinations and COVID relief to all parts of the world, not just our own countries. And we will be working with the EU on those issues in the G7, as I mentioned, the OECD, the WTO, et cetera, et cetera. So Brexit, in one sense, we marked a punctuation point end of January last year. We marked another punctuation point at the end of December. But the UK will be working with the EU, alongside the EU, and pursuing its own interests in the world, including crucially here in the US, on all of those topics and more. And let me just pause there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Antony. Now, Thomas Wright, your opening statements, please.
Thank you, and it's great to be here with everyone. And like Antony said, it's hard to do justice to Brexit in 3 minutes. I think of no other issue that maybe took up more time in UK politics for 4 years, and obviously many twists and turns. But what I'd like to do is maybe look forward a little bit, because I think that where we, one can sort of, I wasn't a fan of Brexit, but I do think that since it's happened, the US has a vested interest in its success, and in trying to find a new equilibrium sort of in Europe, in which that US-UK piece and the US-EU piece, and then both pieces together, work in a very effective way on common challenges internationally, but also challenges in Europe. So I just wanted to make a few points in that regard. I think one thing that sort of struck me is that both in Europe and in the UK, I think both places sort of underestimate in a way the importance of Brexit. So for the EU, they sort of say this is a domestic affair in the UK that's really very little to do with us. It's a bit of a distraction. They wanted to get a deal, we'll engage in that, but we're not going to compromise fundamentally. And in the UK, sometimes you get the view that, this is about getting back our sovereignty, but nothing else really changes, right? Other stuff sort of continues as before. And to me, it's sort of paradoxically more important than that, because I do think it is sort of a reordering moment in Europe. For many decades, we've had a post-war Europe that has had European integration at the core of that. And then the EU and NATO has largely overlapped, not perfectly. Then you've had that alliance with the United States. We now have a situation where, that has come apart. And I think there are tensions between the EU and UK. I do take very much on board what Antony said about the continuing cooperation, but I think you hear from both that things are pretty tense, particularly at the moment. The recent mishap over the triggering of Article 16, I think wouldn't have happened were it not for the frayed context of Brexit. And, you have the Global Britain piece that UK officials sometimes describe, not here, but sometimes describe as, we're a more reliable partner than the EU. And so I think there is a zero-sumness to it at the moment that I think the US, would do well to try to play a facilitating role in finding out a new way in which the UK and EU can relate to each other, and with the US as part of that sort of three-legged stool of cooperation that has been so important. So I think that's something that sort of strikes me this year in particular. The other thing I'd just like to raise is in terms of the UK's orientation on foreign policy. I think we see a UK this year, and maybe for about a year, since about January of last year when Brexit came online formally, that I think is looking for an international role as a supporter of multilateralism, as a problem solver on shared challenges, looking for ways of connecting with democracies in Asia and in other sort of parts of the world. That I think is something to be welcomed, and that we should try to try to make full use of. There has been a pretty significant sea change on UK policy toward China, right? For the last 10 years, the UK was one of the countries in Europe that was most predisposed toward economic partnership with China, sort of relegating the geopolitical piece pretty far down the list. And that now has pretty fundamentally changed, right? The UK is probably closer to the US position on China than other countries in Europe, and is also looking for sort of common ground with democracies in the Asia Pacific as well. So I think that's a fairly fundamental change too. So I think to the extent that we're looking at this in terms of a US-UK lens, I do think there is a lot of sort of opportunity to deepen that relationship. But the one thing I would say is I think it's important to do so in a way that's compatible with the strong US-EU relationship as well, because I think the United States has an interest really in the EU and the UK being in as strong a position as possible now that Brexit has actually happened.
Excellent. Thank you, Thomas. And now we'll go to Graham Wilson and hear his thoughts.
Thank you. As we all know, Brexit was a deeply divisive issue in British politics. It was one which makes our polarization seem at times almost tame. It was a really profound division. And one of the appealing slogans from the last general election was the promise to get Brexit done. In fact, the agreement that is now in place, as we have acknowledged already this afternoon, does not cover the vast majority of the British economy. In fact, 80% of the British economy is not covered by the present deal. And we've seen all sorts of difficulties and tensions arise already, from Langestein to capital investment. And one of the, as I've just indicated, one of the big difference, one of the big gaps in the current agreement is with the financial sector. The financial sector has been of huge importance to Britain, providing 7% of GDP, responsible for 1 million jobs, the majority of which are actually outside London. And yet the current agreement does not protect the British financial sector. It's already seen a very significant blow with the transfer of trading in European stock to Amsterdam. It happened overnight. It was billions of euros or pounds involved, and it is a warning of what could happen if further agreements are not reached with the European Union. It's interesting that the person put in charge of future negotiations with the European Union is Lord Frost, as the Consul General mentioned, somebody who is regarded as being a tough guy, somebody who is somewhat adversarial in his approach to the European Union. And this opens up the risk that far from having got Brexit done, Brexit will continue for a long time to come, with lots of headlines in the British tabloids about the evil machinations of the Germans, or even worse, the French, and continuing tensions as we move from topic to topic and Brexit continues. I also just want to mention how odd all of this seems in terms of what I had thought British politics to be about. I'm old enough to remember how candidates for the Conservative Party were always introduced as the candidate of the Conservative and Unionist Party. And if there was anything that was central to the Conservative tradition, it was caring about the Union. But in the pursuit of Brexit, the Union has very much been put in danger. You may all know about what has been labelled the customs barrier in the Irish Sea, the difficulty of moving goods to Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland essentially remains part of the European market, whereas the rest of Britain does not. And so that's one way in which the Union is endangered. The much more pressing, I think, way is the relationship between England and Wales on the one hand and Scotland on the other. In the last general election, the Scottish Nationalist Party swept all before them in terms of seats in Scotland. They will almost certainly do the same in the elections to the Scottish Assembly in May, and they will then demand another referendum on Scottish independence, making the not implausible claim that being taken out of the European Union changes the situation fundamentally. And although the promise had been made that the last referendum on Scottish independence in 2014 would be the last for a generation, the exit from the European Union is a game changer which justifies another referendum. And then the final point I make is that just as the Conservative and Unionist Party was regarded as the party of the Union, it was always regarded as the party of business. And it is striking to me how the government has been willing to put British economic interests, British industry interests at risk in terms of getting Brexit, in pursuit of getting Brexit done. So I've referenced already the strain on the financial sector. This is not the only sector of the British economy which is going to struggle in terms of relations with Europe. The British newspapers are full of stories of small and medium-sized enterprises finding that the paperwork involved in moving goods to Europe is just making continuing their trade with the European Union too difficult for them. References to 71 pages of paperwork at present, etc. So my image of the Conservative Party, formed over many decades, has been somewhat shaken by the indifference to the fate of the Union and the indifference to important business interests that has been shown in the last few years.
Great, thank you, Graham. And last but not least, Ginny Doellgast, your thoughts?
Thanks. I'm not actually going to try to do justice to Brexit in 3 minutes because I know we have a lot of questions today. So I'm going to really save my substantive comments for the questions from Ali and the audience. But I did want to say just a few seconds on the expertise I bring to this panel. I know Doug already introduced my past research, but through focusing on UK and European industrial relations, I think I bring a slightly different, maybe somewhat outsider perspective to analyzing what impact Brexit might have in the future, maybe more than the impact it's immediately having. And I've also studied the organizational and employment strategies of European firms. So I tend to see Brexit through what are some of the opportunities companies might take advantage of as they confront the opportunities and barriers associated with Brexit. And when I eventually am answering Ali's questions, I can talk about how Brexit will affect worker rights in the UK and worker voice in European companies. That's really where I'm most interested in that impact. And certainly the impact for migrant workers is really going to be central to that, to those effects. I'm also a British citizen, so I have a kind of personal interest in the impact of free movement of labor, even if I have an American accent. I lived there long enough to go from being a migrant worker to becoming a citizen, having all the rights of being a European and to being able to travel and live visa-free in Europe, and then having that taken away. So.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Ginny. And we'll need your expertise in 2 questions approximately. Okay, so now we're going to go to questions, and some of these we took from the audience. So first, to begin with, now that Brexit has happened, a significant amount of the news coverage and kind of general commentary has focused on what's gone wrong in the transition. So everyone's a critic, but maybe perhaps more importantly, many UK citizens and businesses have expressed surprise at the severity of these transition issues, of these growing pains. So first, are these growing pains normal? And second, were voters right to be surprised, or is this something that everyone, both within the UK and without, saw coming? And so first I'm going to ask first Graham and then Thomas to maybe speak to this. And then after that, any panelists, you can feel free to respond. So Graham, if I could pick on you first.
Gosh, was it reasonable for people to be surprised? Well, the Remain camp tried very hard to say that there would be immense difficulties. The reply to that was always that it would be easily accomplished, and that there would be a large number of trade deals that would be done almost overnight with other countries, and that life would be really quite easy. The Leave press now tends to say, well, this is a good thing, this is a shock, this is a wake-up moment, this will energize Britain, just as at one time entering the European Union was supposed to energize British industry. So I think it all depends. Do you think it was reasonable for people to believe the Leave side when they were assured that it would be okay to leave and it wouldn't really be that difficult? Or do you think that they should have paid more attention to what the warnings that the Remain side tried to issue?
Okay, Thomas?
Yeah, look, the first thing is, I think you asked, it's a great question, but you asked in the question, is it normal? Like, there is no normal, right? There is no normal here. There's never been a trade deal that I can think of that was designed to impose, by design, was intended to impose trade barriers and unravel economic relations between one country and another, right? So this is an unprecedented trade deal in that it was starting at a very high level of integration and then working backwards to unwind it. That is just, that is not normal, right? We have basically no experience with that as a matter of, trade diplomacy. There are cases, I guess, where you have countries breaking up. That may be sort of an analogy, but nothing even remotely close to the wealth and sort of advanced industrialized nature of these two entities, right? Of the EU, which is arguably the world's largest economic bloc, and the UK, which is the world's 5th, wealthiest economy. So I think it's just important for everyone, I guess, just to understand that it's uncharted territory and it was always going to be incredibly difficult. And I think what happened was that the British people decided that they're willing to pay, that economic price for a greater measure of political autonomy and political freedom. But that economic price is real. Like, there's no wishing that away, right? The services sector, has really been sort of damaged in this. Wasn't really a factor in the negotiation. Is going to suffer to some degree over time. The UK economy is a very advanced economy. They'll probably figure it out. They'll figure out new ways of working with new partners and of having a new type of relationship with the EU, but it's going to take some time. The final point I'd make is this is a pretty difficult time to be doing this internationally, right? We're at a time of populism, nationalism, places are putting up borders, not tearing them down. We have a new administration in the United States, which is not the America First Trump administration, but it has a noticeably different, slightly more mercantilist economic policy than the Obama administration did, which tells you something just about where the general winds are blowing on this. So I think it's going to be tough. Whether people should have expected it or not, I have no idea. I think some people didn't, but I think it's fairly clear if you look for it.
Okay, they're both very good points made by our panelists, that this is also very difficult to quantify to begin with, and the framing of this would be political, so whether it's difficult or not. Do any other panelists have any thoughts on kind of the growing pains of Brexit before we look to the brighter side? Okay, so now, Antony, this is all you. So obviously taking back sovereignty has resulted in some significant economic shifts. But despite all these transition issues, so what has been delivered to voters? What are some of the new advantages, either realized yet or kind of looking ahead to the future? What are the benefits of being out of the EU for the United Kingdom?
So, I think it's a neat segue from the previous question, which is why I didn't jump in at the back of that bit of the panel answer, because I think it was Thomas who said in his opening remarks that it's important to look forward, because I think it's quite easy to look back and think, why didn't we do this? Or, let's refight yesterday's arguments. We need to look forward, because the one comment I would make in the context of the previous question is, the world is not static. And even since we began the Brexit process, which to some people it's felt like it's been going a long time, actually, if you think about what we were trying to negotiate through the Article 50 process and then through the transition period, doing all of that in 3 years is actually, some people told us we couldn't do it. They said it would take 10. So there are still ongoing negotiations, but that really important piece of looking forward and thinking about the future of the global economy. So how are we going to deal with the challenge of China within the global economy? How are we going to deal with the consequences of the COVID pandemic and indeed the economic crisis, which actually I don't think we can really begin to answer at the minute because it's not over. How are we going to factor in the climate piece and the broader economic resilience piece, the impact on supply chains, and the decisions that governments around the world, not just in the EU or the UK or the US, are taking about their future sort of economic resilience and the decisions it's leading them to make. I'm not an expert, and let's not go down the rabbit hole, but let's look at what's happening in Australia with the tech companies. There are some big shifts within the global economy, which is where I think it's important to have this piece about looking forward. I think it's also important to think about, the traditional arguments about the benefits of trade liberalization, or the traditional arguments we used to make about the benefits that would accrue to a country like the UK being a member of the EU. I think people made a different decision. So now we need to deal with that and look forward. And I really want to come back to something Thomas said about that sort of three-way relationship, EU-UK, UK-US, US-EU. Because actually, if you look at what all of the leaders said at the G7 or the Munich Security Conference, it was about the transatlantic alliance. And I think that needs to be restated, and that needs to be sort of recreated in the context that has been created by these various sort of dynamics. Because if we don't work on these issues together, then we are not going to be so successful in actually dealing with some of the shared challenges that we all face. So yes, Brexit, and actually I would come back to one point at the risk of sounding slightly pedantic. I do actually think that Brexit itself is done. We have exited the EU. That is a fact. It was on the 31st of January last year. This now needs to be about the future economic and security relationship between the UK and the EU in that wider context of our other relationships, and indeed the other relationships that our key partners will be having in the world. Because it's not just about the three of us, even in that global context. Thanks.
Okay, great. It's really, really interesting, especially to hear kind of the, the UK perspective. But now I'd actually like to go to Ginny to talk about so the economic kind of potential of Brexit, in particular workers' rights, labor relations. All of those have been a very salient part of the negotiations and will be kind of maybe an exciting frontier now that Brexit has finished. So Ginny, do you want to talk about how this, what Brexit means for the country on these dimensions?
Sure. So I guess just to preface it, you're going back to the first question, but also the original way that you framed this question. You said, despite transition issues, what has been delivered to voters? And I think on the labor side, it's important to note that new immigration restrictions for European workers is one thing that's been delivered to voters. I was looking at the Conservative website and it was all over their kind of press about what we've done, what we've accomplished with Brexit. It was one of the central issues in the Leave campaign. Taking back control of our borders is a major slogan used to advertise the success of Brexit. And there has overall been a drop in immigration. There's something like, I read a report that said around 1 million migrants left the UK in 2020. About half of those were born in the EU. And so, some of that's connected to COVID and the economic impacts, but it might at least look like the government is delivering on its promise here. And it's important, I think, to, when we discuss Brexit, make sure we don't lose sight that that was a sort of important issue in the campaign and continues to be something that gets talked about a lot. Of course, there are also economic costs like worker shortages, and UK citizens are losing their own rights to free movement in Europe, but I won't go into those here. That could be probably a whole other discussion. But a second potential impact of Brexit, as you said, is on worker rights. So these haven't changed yet, but they're probably on the government's agenda. The Leave campaign argued Brussels was throwing up bureaucracy and red tape for British firms. And a major focus here was on employment regulations. So I'm not going to go too into the details of the EU directives and how those got translated into UK law. But there is one example that's often given in the press on working time regulations. Right, so all workers get 4 weeks of paid holiday, and the working week is limited to 48 hours. So for Americans who see the British as having sort of liberal regulations that are similar to theirs, the EU has really introduced a lot of stronger employment rights that weren't there before. And the trade deal states that Brussels can punish deviation from EU level playing field standards with tariffs, but it's not clear how big a change in labor rights would have to be to trigger this clause. So maybe some of our other panelists have some insight into this. According to the deal I was reading, the details, right, there has to be evidence of impact on trade or investment, which can be difficult to prove. And in January, the Conservatives did announce a review of employment protections, and there was some consultation with business leaders, and then they backtracked and said they weren't going forward with the review. So it has sort of come onto the agenda and then come off the agenda. But still, just being inside the EU will make a difference in how formal rules are enforced. So I'll give a very quick example from my own research at BT, which is a large unionized telecommunications firm. And in 2011, the UK passed legislation that guaranteed equal pay and treatment for agency workers. These are temporary workers on agency contracts, and this was to bring the UK in line with an EU directive. Something like 4,000 temps across BT saw their pay increase, something like 10 or 20%. And then the agencies started exploiting a loophole in the law that allowed lower pay if the agency workers were paid some marginal amount between their jobs. And then this led to a growing gap in pay. The UK Trade Unions Congress, which is like our AFL-CIO, made a formal complaint to the European Commission and argued the UK government failed to properly implement the directive and used evidence from cases like BT to make that case. And then that process were cut short by the Brexit vote. So I give this example just to sort of let Americans know, or to bring a little detail to really make more real or vivid how loss of EU membership through Brexit isn't really just about changes in formal law rules, but it's this kind of loss of resources that have been used to enforce those rules. like UK labor unions and NGOs don't really have that layer of support at the EU level anymore to bring UK worker rights in line with EU-wide social protection. So, example, the European Court of Justice isn't available in the same way that it was before. There are also going to be some effects on worker voice and multinational companies through changes in their rights on European works councils. So the implications of this for inequality and job quality probably be felt further in the future, but these kinds of outcomes are really important to track, I think, to weigh the longer term benefits and costs of leaving the EU.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Ginny. Okay, so we're being flooded with questions about Ireland. So we're going to switch to, how to deal with trade with Northern Ireland, and the Irish backstop has been relatively contentious throughout the whole process. And actually recently, so in the past day, both the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, and the Ulster Unionist Party have said that they're going to mount a legal challenge to the Northern Ireland Protocol, which has created trade barriers between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. So, and this is open to any of our panelists. What do you think of the current Irish solution? And what does Ireland's future look like? Specifically, how likely is reunification? And how will this affect the continuity of the UK as a country? So, which panelist wants to take this very popular question? Thank you, audience, for submitting it. Which one wants to take this first? Okay, great, Antony, thank you.
I feel I ought to say something. I think this is part of the agreement that has attracted some of the most intense scrutiny. And that's quite right, actually, because it's a significance of the commitment, I would say, by both the Irish government, the British government, and indeed the US government over many decades to the Northern Ireland peace process. And we have been clear, the UK government has been clear since the very beginning of the Brexit process after the referendum, that we were fully committed to the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement. We were fully committed to ensuring that there was no risk to that peace process. And that obviously has been complicated to work through. And that's why there is a dedicated committee, the Joint Committee, was headed up by Michael Gove and Commissioner Šefčovič, and will now be taken forward by Lord Frost and Commissioner Šefčovič. And I believe they will meet actually later this week. And they met in London last week as well. And I think that will be a really important part of working through some of the consequences that we're now starting to see, now that we are out of the transition period, sort of bubbling up. But I don't think it undermines the commitment of the British government and the Irish government to work together on this issue. And I think that's a really important point to restate. In terms of what happens in the future, I think it's impossible to speculate. The British government is fully committed to the sanctity of the internal market, including all the nations of the United Kingdom, committed to working with the Irish government and the Commission to address the issues that are arising, and that's what we will continue to do.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
Thank you for that perspective. Do you have any others from panelists?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in as well. And you might be able to tell from my accent, I grew up in Dublin, so I moved to the US when I was 25. But, I think it's been a very difficult issue because Brexit basically created this sort of impossible dilemma for the people of Northern Ireland, for the Good Friday Agreement, where basically things could not stay the way that they were, and there was only a very small number of options, and all of them sort of sucked in a different way, right? None of them, there was no happy sort of solution based on technology or anything else, that was sort of elusive out there that we just needed to think of. The solutions were pretty well known, and they were basically a hard border, on the island of Ireland, basically a sea border where you'd have sort of customs checks, even if they're not formally called that, but basically you'd have some friction on that border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. And the third option is you would basically, which is what the original backstop was, you would pin the UK as a whole so closely to the EU in terms of the single market and customs union that for Brexiteers, it would feel like they didn't really leave, right? That they still had to abide by all of the rules and regulations, but they had no say over those rules and regulations, which is sort of what the original, backstop was that Theresa May had was intended to do. Each of those three options, is unpalatable to either everyone or to a significant number of people. Now, the option that's being opted for by the British government as the least worst of those options is friction, between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, which means that it's more difficult to bring in goods because of the worry about leakage into the EU and all of these things. And that's created significant discomfort, I would say, amongst the unionist community. And that's, I think, what will have, it is serious, I think, and that will need to be addressed. But the problem is that it's, it's sort of part of the recipe, right? It's almost by design, because that's sort of the trade-off that was made in the deal recently. The more recent problem as well is that the EU, in a moment, I think, of frustration over the vaccines and generally with the UK, for a brief few-hour period a few weeks ago, decided to blow the whole thing up and trigger this emergency part of the protocol because they didn't want vaccines going into Northern Ireland and being sent on to Great Britain. And that's created significant repercussions, because the unionists that are unhappy with this arrangement are now saying, look, this means that we can sort of unravel it too. So I think it is a very delicate situation. I think the good news is that, the UK government, the EU, and of course the Irish and American administrations are all at the moment sort of on board with this arrangement and committed to trying to see it through. And I wouldn't underestimate, to be frank, the role of the Biden administration in this, because I think having such a clear statement from the president that this really matters to him, I think has been not a forcing mechanism, but has generally just set the political climate on this, which makes it clear that, that even if the other parties are committed to it, that if they weren't, then that the US would sort of get involved, which I think has helped to some degree last fall when there was an issue over this in a different way over the internal markets bill.
That's great. I mean, it's very clear that the Irish issue in particular is very salient, but, I actually also lived in London during Brexit, working at the London School of Economics. And what I think a US audience might not realize is that Northern Ireland and Ireland are actually fundamentally different. So the idea that this would automatically lead to reunification, from my experience there, all parties involved are very aware of the Good Friday Agreement, all the issues, and it's a very unique setup that Northern Ireland and Ireland has, that a lot of you have been asking questions about reunification.
Can I just add, can I just add one thing on that? Because I think It's just important for everyone to understand that, the Good Friday Agreement was based on the principle of consent, right? That it was seen as important that any change in the status of Northern Ireland would have to happen with the consent of both communities. The Irish government, I think, has rightly interpreted that as meaning that you need unionist consent, right? Not a 50% plus one head count in Northern Ireland, that the minute you think you can get just over the 50% threshold, then there's a united Ireland, right? Because if that were to happen, you wouldn't have solved this issue of consent, and you'd just be creating a very combustible sort of situation politically, right? That could lead to unrest. So I don't think you're going to see, and I think you're already seeing the opposite from Dublin. You're not going to see a push for how do we take advantage of this situation to get a united Ireland. Like you're going to see them, having gotten what they wanted on keeping the border open, I think really try to slow things down, pull it back, and in a way advocate for the concerns of the unionist community to make sure this whole thing doesn't get out ahead of where everyone is. So you will have some, Sinn Féin, I think, will advocate for a unification referendum, but I think they'll be pretty alone in that. So I think as people look at this, it may or may not happen in our lifetimes, but I think it definitely won't be something that you'll see a big sort of push for in the next sort of 5 or even 10 years outside of, the parties that are very explicitly committed to it?
Okay, and so I'm actually going to segue from that to, because you mentioned that now the Biden administration is a significant change in terms of relations between the US and the UK, or at least the relationship between the UK and the Trump administration was different and will most likely be different than kind of future relations. And so a lot of our attendees want to know, now that Brexit has happened, does this have any significant changes to the UK-US relationship, good or bad, diplomatically, economically? Basically, what does this mean for the US? Why should the US care about Brexit? What does the future look like? So any panelists can jump in on US-UK relations post-Brexit.
I think one would have to start by saying that the UK was a really valuable ally of the United States within the European Union. Obviously, the British have prided themselves on having a special relationship with the United States. A lot of discussion about what that means and whether Americans see it in the same way as the British do. But it was one of the ways in which Britain could sell itself, if you like, to the United States, as saying you have a loyal friend in the European Union. We tend to see a lot of issues in the same way, particularly in terms of economic policy. And I think that the challenge for the British now will be to maintain the attractiveness to the United States in spite of losing that presence and that role in the European Union. And the Consul General has mentioned the push by Britain to strengthen multilateral institutions. And I think for a middle-sized power, if you like, compared with the giant blocs or the giant nation states like the United States or China, the way has to be through multilateral institutions.
I mean, if I could just jump on the back of that, I've been lucky enough. I've worked in Washington previously between 2000 and 2004. There was a particular context for the UK-US relationship. I went from there to be Tony Blair's Private Secretary for Foreign Affairs. Those were, again, the debates around the nature of the UK-US relationship. Were we a bridge? Were we a hub? Were we a pivot? Et cetera, et cetera. I think, again, this is time to look forward. I think the UK was always trying to be more than just the US's voice in European capitals or in Brussels. And I also think that US administrations always had other partners within the European Union. Do I think there is something quite particular about the UK-US relationship in terms of our economic engagement, our security engagement, the people-to-people links, some of the shared history, but it's, again, we're not unique in that sense. I do think there's something special there. I also do genuinely believe that the previous administration, this administration, had certain interests in the world that we were wanting to pursue together. But again, it wasn't just it wasn't a one-dimensional relationship, and it won't be as we address, as I said earlier, some of the big challenges: COVID recovery, climate, the dynamics within the global economy, restating a case for a belief in trade liberalization and liberal democratic values. I think the UK and US will be on the same side of those discussions, but with others. And I think any British Prime Minister has always seen it as key to have a good working relationship with an American president, but has always then gone on to say it's not just about sort of the top two bits of the system. It's so much more integrated than that. And that, again, I think we come back to this sense of needing to look forward. The Prime Minister, when he was speaking at the Munich Security Conference, welcomed the President's rejoining the Paris Agreement on climate. He welcomed the fact that President Biden, in his own words, said America is back on the global stage, committed to multilateralism, not for the sake of multilateralism, but because that's the best way of delivering American objectives in the world. And I think there is a synergy there with UK interests, but also other European interests. So I personally, at least, would always keep coming back to it. This is not an either or. This is about nations committed to some shared strategic interests and values, pursuing those values together in the world. Do I think that it's a good thing to have a UK-US relationship close and engaged at the heart of that? Yes, I do. But again, going back to what Thomas said at the beginning, also in the context of an EU-US, UK-US, UK-EU, and indeed other parts of the world, because all of these issues are now global. Thanks.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for all those really interesting answers. I wish we had 2 more hours to discuss Brexit, but in the interest of time, we are now going to have a rapid fire round where I'm going to ask each of the panelists to answer yes, no, or too close to call. You can feel free to answer any of these on the issue of Scotland and will the UK ever return? And then we'll have closing statements. And if you'd like to elaborate on either Scotland or the future of the European Union, you can. So first on the Scottish question, so many of our attendees want to know equally, just like with Northern Ireland, Scotland has already seen an independence referendum that did not go through, but now that Scotland does not have the benefit of EU trade, they're wondering, will Scotland seek independence, or how likely do you think that sometime in the next 10 years, Scotland will choose to seek independence? And so I'm going to ask you, will Scotland seek independence? And I'm just going to go down the line, yes, no, or too close to tell, or, any other sort of abstain if you don't want to answer. Okay, so Graham, I'm going to start with you. So will Scotland seek independence, yes or no?
I think, as the Duke of Wellington said about the Battle of Waterloo, it's going to be a damn close thing.
Excellent, thank you, Graham. Okay, Ginny, what do you think?
Too close to call, I don't know.
Okay, Thomas? Oh, Thomas, you're on mute.
No, but can I give a 1-sentence explanation?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Look, they desperately want to leave, I think, and they feel very aggrieved over what happened. But the problem they have is that to leave is basically Brexit all over again, with them in the position of the UK, right? They're the smaller party. They share a common currency, which makes it even more difficult than Brexit. They have a land border, and that wasn't an issue in the last independence referendum, because that border was going to remain open, of course, because they were both in the EU. So the technical challenge of doing this has become exponentially harder because of Brexit. The desire to do it has gone up, but ultimately there is no answer to the technical problems they face. So I think they stay, but they really try to figure it out, but ultimately they fail.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you, Thomas. And Antony, what do you think, or what is the official position, since you are?
So I'm afraid I'm not going to give you a one-word answer. I will restate, because I think this is important as well, the commitment of the British government to create future opportunities for all parts of the United Kingdom. The Prime Minister speaks very passionately about levelling up, delivering growth, jobs, economic security to all parts of the United Kingdom. That, of course, includes Scotland, as well as the other nations of the United Kingdom. That's what I do day in, day out here, both as Consul General and as Trade Commissioner for North America. There is a debate going on, obviously. It's very visible to all of us. But the Prime Minister's contention is that we are stronger together, and he is very, very committed to the Union.
Okay, great. Okay, so one more rapid fire round before we close. Do you think it's likely, again, say next decade, maybe 20 years, if you'd like to quantify, you can, that the UK ever rejoins the EU? So is this Brexit forever, or do we think one day they'll join on new terms? And so we're going to go in reverse order. So Antony, what do you think? Is there ever the EU in the UK's future again?
I think the UK will continue to have a very close working relationship with the EU. What that looks like in future years, I think, will be determined by the challenges that we face and the policies of the government in the UK, and indeed the governments of the EU. Because the EU, one thing we haven't touched on here, but I think again is a reality, the EU is not a static context or concept. The world will change. Do I think there will be a close working relationship between the UK and the EU? Yes, I do. Do I know what that looks like in 5, 10, 15 years' time? No, I don't, but that's what we'll work out.
That's a good point. That's a very good point, actually. Okay, I forgot what order I went in the last time, so I'm just going to pick. Thomas, what do you think?
I think you have that order right. Yeah.
Okay.
No, I don't think, not for generation or more. I think it's been so torturous, the decision has been made, now. I think it's very unlikely. Maybe in 20 years, but then only if it was viewed to be such a catastrophic failure that it fundamentally changed the domestic politics. And I think we all hope that won't happen, obviously, but I think that would be the scenario if it became discredited, like the invasion of Iraq was or something, and you just saw this political change over time, but that will take, many years, I think, to occur, if at all.
Okay, great. Ginny.
Yeah, and I don't really like the crystal ball questions because I don't have a good sense of, what will happen in the future. So I think maybe less eloquent statement, echoing what Thomas and Antony said, but, I think it will certainly be a long-term process if anything like that were to happen. And there are multiple varieties of membership already within the EU, and you can imagine in the future some other form of that happening as you run into all the kinds of friction and difficulties that I have no doubt Brexit will create. So that's my.
I know the crystal ball questions are tough, but we really like tough questions here. Okay, finally, last but not least, Graham.
Can I just give my answer? No to formally rejoining. Yes, over 10 years or more to Brexit in name only, where lots of detailed agreements gradually bring closer alignment.
Excellent. Okay, so, we only have a couple more minutes. And so actually, I'll just ask any panelists who wish to give closing remarks. I'll give you the opportunity before we'll all let everyone go to dinner or whatever time it happens to be in your time zone. So any panelists wish to give ending remarks?
I think that I wanted to jump back to what Virginia said about immigration, because I think that immigration from Europe has diminished. I think immigration from other parts of the world continues. One of the features of the current British government, not fully realized in the United States, is how racially, ethnically diverse it is in the senior positions, which I think is an interesting sign of how Britain has changed and Britain will continue to change. But at the same time, the political advantage to the Conservatives came very much from the immigration issue. So there's a fascinating tension there, which I will enjoy watching play out in the future.
I have a quick observation that's maybe not directly related to labor rights, but I think one really interesting impact Brexit is having is this heightened public awareness of how closely the UK economy is tied to Europe. And you see boring technical details around international trade, which newspapers would never cover, and now they're headlines and public interest stories, like how checks and paperwork disrupt exports of seafood and how many UK manufacturing jobs depend on EU-wide supply chains, EU derivatives, why they matter to the UK financial services industry. And all of these, this kind of shows that there is this economic integration. I think it's also changing the consciousness of British voters in some ways. And it'll be interesting, I think, what impact that has down the line. But also, of course, this, I think, shows in a very visible way how economic integration means that countries and regions are constantly competing for investment within Europe. And so labor costs and flexibility play a role into that. And it makes it hard for one country to go it alone in strengthening worker rights. So I think a key challenge in the post-Brexit era, sorry, I did bring it back to worker rights, is keeping this level playing field in social regulation. So that will be, I think, a key benchmark for judging the success of Brexit as well, and improving quality of life in the UK.
Great. Thomas or Antony, any last thoughts? No? You're content? Okay, great. Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists and thank all of our attendees. I'm now going to hand the virtual microphone over to Professor Kreiner, who will give some announcements. So thank you all. And Doug, the floor is yours.
Just very quickly again, Antony, Graham, Ginny, Tom, thank you so much for taking the time and for your expertise. Really engaging discussion. And thanks to all of you for joining us. One last reminder, March 18th, a conversation with President Clinton on the future of American democracy. We hope to see you there, and thank you and good night. Bye, everyone.